Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to week 3 of World Civilizations 1. If you are here, you should be viewing this video pretty early on in the week, because this is our first topic, the Middle Kingdom and new states in Asia. Now, as always, we'll start off with key terms, because do please remember, this is where a lot of your content quiz information and writing assignment information is going to come from. So, today, the main things we're going to look at are the Indo-European migrations, two-wheel chariots, territorial states, the Middle Kingdom, and we'll also look a bit at Babylon today. So, keep those in mind as best you can throughout the rest of this class. Now, also, I do want to make sure you're aware of important upcoming dates. Do please remember that on weeks when you don't have major writing assignments or debates, you will also have either a creative response or a discussion forum due. But these are where I'm going to just post the big assignments that are worth the largest chunk of your grade. Your first content quiz is coming up this Friday for October the 2nd at 5 p.m. That will be found in this week's weekly folder. You'll just download it and turn it in right there. Your final essay thesis statement is also coming up on October the 9th at 5 p.m. As I'll detail in future emails, this assignment is located in your final essay folder on Blackboard. That is where it has all the details for this assignment and what I expect. Should be pretty straightforward, but essentially what I want you to do is give me a well-organized thesis statement, giving me what your potential idea for your thesis statement is going to be. For more examples on what I expect for that, please go through some of the previous lectures I posted that detail good thesis statement writing, and feel free to check with me at any time. However, today what we're going to do is to go ahead and start off looking at climate change. Please excuse that last slide. I'll make sure I remove it before I post this onto Blackboard. I'm using somewhat of the same PowerPoints that I use for my class that's throughout the whole 16-week semester, and so there's some things that look like I forgot to cut. But in the meantime, a couple things I want you to consider throughout really the rest of the semester, but especially these few weeks. Big thing we're going to talk about is the influence of climate change on civilization development. So I want you to keep a few things in mind. Does the study of climate change actually matter in history? Does it matter? Yeah, does it matter specifically throughout history? What are some examples? Why do we focus so much on climate change in ancient history? And what kind of impact has climate and climate change already had on some of the civilizations we've talked about? Look at things like rivers and its influence on irrigation specifically. But in the meantime, first thing we're going to do is look at the collapse of the first civilizations. This is again a product of this being only a 12-week course. We've already gone from the first civilizations to their collapse. Now, most historians and archaeologists credit the collapse of the Old Kingdom in Egypt, for example, specifically happening around 2200 BCE as a result of widespread climate change. As far as we can tell, this is basically the big picture. There was a warming and drying period that hit most of Afro-Eurasia, so all across the African, European, and Asian continents, that lasted roughly from 2200 to 2150 BCE. There are a few climatological pieces of evidence for the impact of this climate change. For example, in Egypt, they found done sedimation studies, which is where you study the amount of sediment being deposited in rivers over time, to reveal that the Nile floods were lower and that there were more sand dunes. In Mesopotamia, there's evidence that the Habur drainage basin, which was part of the Tigris and Euphrates, was completely abandoned by 2100 BCE due to rising soil aridity, which just means it wasn't as available to farm. Harappan society, there have been hydroclimatic studies which have shown that participation across the board decreased between 3000 and 2000 BCE, and whole rivers had dried up by 1700 BCE. Now, why would all these changes in particular have such a negative effect on these first civilizations? Give you an awkward pause again. But yeah, as you can imagine, this again relates to the importance of rivers. Remember, with these rivers drying up and being abandoned, these civilizations are losing their access to the irrigation systems they need in order to produce the food they need to survive. So for example, if the Nile has lower floods, that's less water available for your crops. If you're having to abandon drainage basins, you lose access to pretty much your entire irrigation system. And of course, the same thing is going on in the Harappan society. When you have entire rivers dry up, you lose access to that water you need to survive. So again, this is sort of a reinforcement of the importance of rivers and civilizations. When they're gone, you lose access to everything you need to keep your civilization going. Just to give you an idea of how bad this got, there was an Egyptian tomb inscription from the collapse of the Old Kingdom, which read, "All of Egypt was dying of hunger to such a degree that everyone had come to eating his children." So again, this just reinforces the idea that when you lose access to the water and irrigation systems, your whole food supply collapses. Now, at the same time as this was going on, and as a result of this climate change, as you might imagine, mass migrations were going on as well. Once these civilizations started to collapse, different people groups started to move towards the more settled areas in search of food and resources. This period is known as the Indo-European migrations. Now, we hear a lot about migration and immigration in our society today. Let's focus on the positive for the moment. How is different migrations going to help these civilizations grow? These are our awkward pauses we'll all have to get used to. But yes, as you might imagine, migrations typically help civilizations grow because new people bring in new types of resources and new types of technologies and methodologies. So, if you stay in the same place for a long time, you're obviously not going to really learn anything new. But when new migrants come in, they bring in their technologies and their different practices with them. This typically causes civilizations to develop and to hopefully grow. Now, one thing I want to focus on to explain the overall importance of these migrations is their impact on language. The Indo-European migration is theorized to explain the various similarities that occurred between Hindu, Persian, Greek, Sanskrit, and eventually as well the German and English languages. All these languages have various similarities, and it's believed that it's because they all came from these initial Indo-European migrations. As different people migrated across the world, they brought their languages with them, they started to mingle together and start to pick up these different similarities as they developed. For example, all these languages use similar numbering systems, and they all have similar terms such as referring to a mother and a father, and they have similar terms referring to gods and various deities. For example, the word mother is very similar in all these languages. It's mater in Sanskrit, meter in Greek, mater in Latin, mère in French, and Mutter in German. So again, pretty clear similarities. Now again, how do these similarities all show the importance of migration in human history and culture? Awkward pause again. But yeah, that's one I essentially gave away already. As these migrants go around, they not only bring their technology and their practices with them, it also changes cultures as well. So instead of having completely alien and different languages all across the world, there are various similarities that can allow for contact because they arguably all came from common sources. So again, culture gets spread around when these migrants go around as well, not just their technology and their stuff. Technological achievements are also important to consider as well, particularly with the two-wheel chariot, as you can see here. In the 3000s BCE, for the first time in the Caucasus Mountains, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, in southeastern Europe, people began to domesticate horses. Around the 2000s BCE, they began to use harnesses made of bone and bronze in order to utilize horses for transportation. Now, why would this in particular be a big and important development for this time? Think about some of the stuff we've already talked about. Right, but yes. This is particularly important because of all the migrations going on. With these migrants having to travel all across the world, being able to use horses for your transportation makes them much quicker and much easier. This was even more developed by 2000 BCE, when more of these nomads in the Caucasus Mountains began to connect harnesses to two-wheel chariots. So instead of just having a normal harness to ride the horse with, you can now connect a chariot to it. Now, just a quick thing to focus on real quick. Why do you think it was the nomads who did it first? Awkward pause again. But yeah, this is another example of nomads needing things like this more. Nomads are traveling, they're going to be more concerned with technology that allows that travel to be easier. How, because of this, it was actually these settled peoples, or the ones who weren't migrating, who upgraded the chariots with bronze and iron designs. This shows that it's the settled people have these more metalworking technologies they can focus on, while again, the nomads' priorities is on transportation. By 1600 BCE, the war chariot, as you can see here an example of, had been perfected, typically with an archer and driver combo. To give you a better idea of what that was like, I'd like you to watch this video, or go ahead and pause this video and watch this video I have attached here with info on chariot combat. This is possibly one of the coolest historians in the world, and he shows you a little bit about what Egyptian chariot combat in particular would have been like. Keep in mind as you watch this, what's so impressive about chariot combat, how ancient warriors make chariot combat more adaptable, and why chariots are so effective during this time period. So again, if you haven't already, please pause this video and go ahead and watch this link. Go follow this link at this point. Alright, I'll go ahead and assume you've done that. Now, with all these migrants coming in and changing civilizations, this led to the rise of the first territorial states in human history. Territorial states are centralized kingdoms with charismatic rulers that spread beyond city-states. Now, why do you think territorial states would rise during this time period? All right, very good. Again, it ties back to the climate change and the migrants. With more people traveling across the world and with traveling technology being more readily available and more efficient, it's much easier to spread your influence outside of just a city-state. So again, travel often leads to the growth of civilizations territorially because they're traveling to new places and extending their authority. A couple of important effects that I think are interesting about territorial states. For one, this is the first time in recorded history we can see a shared identity and allegiance among different groups of people. So, for example, as you can see here in this map, instead of just considering yourself a citizen of Nineveh, for example, later in history you would consider yourself a citizen of Assyria or the Assyrian Empire. So, for example, if someone asks you your nationality, how are you going to respond? Yeah, I'm assuming most of you would respond that you're an American, because most of us were born here or are legal citizens here. You would identify yourself as an American. How might this change the way people behave since they now have such a large shared identity? All right, as you might have guessed, again after the awkward pause, it is what made these territorial states possible. Before, again, using Nineveh or let's use Memphis as an example this time. If you had lived in Memphis in modern day Egypt, you would only consider yourself really a citizen of that city. You would only be loyal and willing to fight for your city. However, now since there's this shared identity and these rulers are controlling larger areas, more people are willing to band together and cooperate. You get larger armies, you get larger political systems. Instead of just identifying as part of a smaller city, people are willing to work and fight on behalf of larger territories. So, for example, in America, if we didn't consider ourselves as Americans and part of a larger group, we would not have a United States military, we wouldn't have a United States government, we would just have smaller stuff for our cities or individual states. It allows people to band together and have a larger sense of self, essentially. Now, this of course directly led to the rise of the Middle Kingdom in ancient Egypt. The Middle Kingdom is credited as having lasted from 1975 to 1640 BCE and began after the Nile flooded waters started to get to their normal course by 2050 BCE. One thing I want to focus on is the use of religion in this Middle Kingdom. As before, religion is still an important part of the governments at this time period. Amenemhet I is the first pharaoh of this dynasty from 1985 to 1955 BCE, and he popularized the hidden god Amun. If you remember from a couple of weeks ago, Amun was one of the main gods of the Egyptian theology, and he was credited as being some sort of hidden, powerful god. Now, why do you think Amenemhet would pick this god in particular to be his state god? Think about what that might accomplish for him if people think that he has the hidden God on his side. All right. For those some of you who are a bit more, some of you might figure this out. It's almost like he's blackmailing the Egyptian people, you could argue, into good behavior and loyalty. This hidden God is meant to symbolize his hidden omnipotence and all-knowing power throughout the Egyptian kingdom. People would think that if he has this hidden God on his side, his eyes and ears are always out there, he's involved in every aspect of Egyptian society. Because of this, Amun was now the most revered god throughout all of ancient Egypt. Part of the reason is because his main attributes were just air and breath. That's the main things he was associated with besides being hidden, which, as you might imagine, some belief in the importance of air and breath, since we all have to breathe to not die, were very common in a lot of belief systems. This made it very easy for other people to start worshiping him. He also merged eventually with the sun god Re, which led himself to be called Amon-Re. So again, very positive, shows the impact of religious migrations and the blending together of different religious traditions. Now, in particular, why would a unified religion be so beneficial to these territorial states? Like, why would it be helpful if we all had the same religion? All right, very good. Imaginary classes isn't actually here. It's again going to inspire that common identity and a sense of loyalty. Then, since if we're all part of different religions, we might compete and not want to get along. But if you get most people in your territorial state unified with the same religion, gives us again a common sense of identity and beliefs and morality, and helps motivate people to serve the state. Because if you all believe in the same religion that is supported by your government or your leader, makes you much more likely to be loyal. So again, it's about using religion to unify people. For better or for worse, that's up to you. Now, going ahead and moving on to Mesopotamia, just to give you a quick summary, there were similar impacts from climate change and migration in Mesopotamia as there was in Egypt. For example, the soil in the river basins lost most of their nutrients for a while, so civilizations collapsed because of that as well. Salt water started to spill into the marshes, so it was much more difficult to grow your crops, and the main branch of the Euphrates River actually dried up and shifted west during this global warming period. So this entire civilization essentially had to move. A bit of an impact with the migrants as well. The Amorites were one of the most well-known migrant groups in Mesopotamia at this time. Again, remember, why were migrants starting to come in closer to the cities? This will hopefully show how much you were paying attention. Let me go ahead and get my face out of the way, by the way, while I'm thinking of it. But yeah, as you might imagine, as you hopefully will remember from what we talked about earlier, since the climate is being so negatively affected across the world, migrants are trying to come closer to where people are gathering to take advantage of their resources and to take advantage of their technology. These Amorites were typically herders who provided raw materials to the Mesopotamian cities. They were required to pay taxes, serve as warriors and laborers for city-states, but they were typically not given very many political rights. What do you think is probably going to happen there? Awkward pause again. But yes, as you might imagine, again, imaginary student, this led to frequent conflicts between the Amorites and their local city-states. Most people throughout history, this is a very common theme, don't like having a lot required of them with few rights in return. So, because of this, the state of Babylon, which many of you have probably heard of, began to rise at this point. Around 2000 BCE, the Amorites joined with other migrants in modern-day Iran to overthrow the third dynasty of Ur. This led to the founding of the Old Babylonian Kingdom, which mostly dominated the region for about a millennium. This area was centered in the city of Babylon, which is near modern-day Baghdad. Now, one thing I want to give you an idea of is Mesopotamian politics. Mesopotamian and Babylonian politics were mainly based off of Amorite social structure from what the nomads were like before. There was based around tribal affiliations, mainly controlled by the ruling chief, which eventually became the kingship that became hereditary as their influence grew. One of the more important aspects of this system was their tribute system. Weaker neighbors were forced to trade tribute in luxury goods raw materials, and manpower, which was paid to local businessmen instead of being paid to tax collectors. Now, why would this tribute be so important? Awkward pause again. Yeah, this one is Economics 101. If you need to, in order to grow your empire and to sustain all your people, you have to have quite a bit of luxury of various goods and resources available. So requiring these people to pay tribute ensures that the system can continue. The king was also would offer protection for a confederation of city-states in return. So again, this isn't just about individual city-states. As the king's influence starts to grow, you're able to control a large confederation of city-states. One of the most notable leaders of the old Babylonian kingdom is Hammurabi, more commonly known as Hammurabi, who lived sometime roughly from 1792 to 1750 BCE. He is actually the king who is credited with making Babylon his capital. Now, one of the ruling ideas he came up with was to appoint regional governors to oversee the provinces throughout his kingdom. So instead of ruling everything directly himself, he had some governors who would do it for him. Now, what would be some of the pros of that system? Think about, for example, as a point of comparison, in America, why each state has governors instead of the president just directly overseeing everything all the time. Well, yes, arguably, which is of course a very hotly debated topic these days, but arguably it should make things much more efficient. Instead of Hammurabi having to deal with every single issue himself, he has advisors and governors who can deal with some of the issues for him. So by delegating and spreading out influence, it should mean more things can get directly addressed, and you have less of a backlog of different issues not getting attention. However, as you might imagine, some of the cons of this include frequent rebellions. If you give these governors too much power, they might try to take your spot. So again, this is going to be as you might imagine, this is going to be a very frequent issue that's going to pop up throughout the semester. If you don't have governors and don't delegate some of your power, it typically makes your government less efficient, but if you give them too much power and influence, they're typically going to also try to overthrow you. Hammurabi, as most of you know, is typically most famous for his eye for an eye system of law. Now, just to put it simply, what does an eye for an eye system of law mean? Sorry, I thought I heard something. I might be going crazy. But yeah, this of course is very simple. For example, those of you who are familiar with the Bible will be familiar with this as well. It's just a very basic law system where if I do something bad to you, something equally bad is done to me. Now, think again about why a system of laws might be so important for Hammurabi or Hammurabi. How does it benefit him? Again, awkward pause. Yeah, there's the very immediate impact where it will keep people in line and teach them loyalty. But again, it's all about that system of that idea of unity and efficiency. If you have different laws in different city-states, things are going to get very complicated, and people not be willing to unite and get along. For example, remember in the for those of you who are more familiar with American history, with the Articles of Confederation, a lot of times the original 13 states didn't get along very well because they had different system of laws and economic ideas in each state. So if I went from North Carolina to Georgia, I might have a whole different system of laws and economic principles I have to learn just to get by. But if you have a uniform system of law, everyone is, of course, theoretically treated the same in it no matter where they go, so it gives, again, that sense of a common identity. Now, what I want you to do, if you haven't done so already, is make sure you go over the Hammurabi's code reading I've put on Blackboard and be prepared to look at the following questions. First, looking at the beginning of the code. Why does he spend so much time talking about the gods at the beginning of the code? What does he emphasize about his relationship with the gods, and why would he spend so much time doing that? Next, he talks quite a bit about his accomplishments. Why does he spend so much time talking about his accomplishments? What is that going to do for him? Finally, let's get into the meat of it. What are some of the aspects of daily life that the code covers, and why do you think it's so far-reaching? Lastly, do you agree with this code? Why or why not? And what is the point of this eye for an eye concept? How is it so useful? So look over the code, keep those questions in mind if you have not done so already. All right, I'm assuming you're back with us at this point. So what we're going to do to end the day is just relatively quickly wrap up some of the more minor, by comparison, migrant groups and civilizations that were forming during this time period. First off, we'll look at the Indus River Valley. As I mentioned earlier, in around 1700 BCE, the population of the old Harappan civilizations had plummeted. Hopefully you remember why at this point. Awkward pause. But yes, this again shows the impact of climate change. Because of all the climate change and the impacts on the rivers, the Harappan civilization had gone quite downhill and vanished by this point. Around 1500 BCE, a group of people known as the Aryans, which translates to respected ones, came to this valley from inner Eurasia. They would eventually be known as the Vedas, knowledge, or the Vedic peoples. They spoke a Sanskrit language. They were well known for domesticating horses and chariots, and they were great experts with copper and bronze metallurgy, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Do any of my engineering or maybe welding experts in here know a little bit about metallurgy? Metallurgy, however you pronounce it. All right, as you might know, this is basically where you combine different metals to make newer, more efficient, and stronger metals. This led the Vedas people to develop pretty impressive metal technology. And this is something that will keep coming up as well. They also had a very elaborate religious system. They primarily worshipped sky gods, horse gods, and particularly Indra, the god of war. One of the main religious practices I wanted to focus on for now is the Ashvamedha. This was a year-long ritual unless the warriors would accompany the local king's horse. If no one could kill this horse, it was brought back and sacrificed. Now, I thought that frankly sounded like a bit of a ridiculous ritual at first, but why might it be such a great display of the king's power? Awkward pause again. But yes, look at the fact that warriors were with this horse. These were typically the best warriors of the kingdom. If no one's able to kill the horse, it means that they weren't able to defeat the king's warriors either. So it essentially is a great way for the king to demonstrate the power of his military, while also showing his loyalty to the gods, since he still ultimately sacrifices his great king horse. Now, we'll wrap things up on the Shang dynasty, but I do want to mention that despite the fact that I didn't spend much time on these guys today, do remember the Vedas people and the Vedic peoples. They're going to come up quite frequently throughout the rest of the semester. But in the meantime, we will look at the Shang dynasty. The Shang dynasty was founded in China in 1600 BCE by the quite possibly mythical leader Tang, who defeated a corrupt Xia king and offered to sacrifice himself to end great drought in China. He survived to found the Shang territorial state, which was the only major territorial state in China at the time. Now, why might that be so significant for them? Right, it actually means that relatively, the Shang dynasty is going to have a bit of an easier time developing compared to some of these other civilizations. They had no one to compete with. So because of this, they're arguably going to have a less developed military, but they're going to have an easier time developing and not be as fierce because they really have no one to compete with. Finally, what purpose is this founding story going to serve for the Shang government? Like, for example, how would you feel if you found out that our current president or some president has willingly sacrificed themselves to try to save us all from a great tragedy? All right, very good, imaginary student. This is again used to inspire loyalty in the government. If people believe that their leaders are descended from this great sacrificial hero, it inspires great loyalty in them. Their state was known for a few important things. They were, all like the Vedas people, great at copper metal industry. They made pottery like the Longshan, which their pottery was clearly influenced by the Longshan. They did have walled towns, and they were known for their bone divination, which we'll talk a little bit more about in the coming weeks. A little bit about their religion and society. They were also a theocratic state. They believed that they received guidance from the gods and the ancestors, which popularized ancestor worship across China. As I mentioned, they practiced divination, which is where you would use rituals to communicate with your ancestors and ultimately to predict the future. Finally, the Shang rulers were officially deified upon death and believed to join their gods as their ancestors as gods. Why would this also benefit the Tangs and their government specifically? Awkward pause once again. But yes, as you might imagine, this greatly benefits them because if you believe that your rulers are going to become gods one day and are descended from gods, it inspires great loyalty if you, again, buy into this religious system. Most people aren't really going to be willing to go against their gods. Finally, there was a death ritual I do want to focus on just a little bit. As in many ancient societies, men held the most social and political power. They took the precedence in inheritance, for example. Women were married into various families and typically only gained honor from motherhood. They really didn't have any other major say in society. Because of this, in the death ritual, royal elites or any other nobility were typically buried with their wives and their possessions and all of their slaves. So this shows that even in death, men were typically given priority over women. However, I do think it's important to focus on an exception to this rule. Sometime during the Shang dynasty, there was a woman named Fu Hao, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. She was a consort to the king, considered to be a great military leader and a divination expert. She was actually given her own tomb as part of her death ritual and was buried with a great amount of bronze, jaded materials, or her oracle bones, 6 dogs, and 16 people to accompany her into the afterlife. So, I think it is important to focus on exceptions like these because it's very easy for us to dismiss women in history by just focusing on all the times they were excluded. But even as far back as ancient China, there are examples of women who were able to break against societal norms. So I do think it's important to focus on that when we can. In the meantime, do please remember some of your final reminders. You do have a few important assignments coming up. Please let me know if you have any questions about those. But in the meantime, have a great rest of your week and let me know if I can be of any assistance. Thank you.